tie. Most people think avoidant individuals don't feel deeply, but that's not true. When an avoidant truly loves someone, it doesn't look loud, dramatic, or emotional at first. It looks quiet, confusing, even distant. But behind that distance, something powerful is happening. Because for an avoidant, real love isn't about constant closeness, it's about choosing to stay, even when intimacy feels uncomfortable. And when they start doing things they usually avoid for anyone else, that's when you know it's real. When someone with an avoidant attachment style chooses to stay, it is not a casual decision, and it is not something that happens by default. In fact, their natural emotional wiring pushes them in the opposite direction. Their instinct is to create space when things feel too intense, too demanding, or too emotionally close. So when they remain present in a relationship despite that internal pressure to withdraw, it carries a deeper meaning than most people realize. It is not about convenience. It is not about habit. It is about a quiet but powerful form of choice that goes against their strongest defense mechanism. To understand this fully, you have to see what easy to leave actually means for them. For an avoidant person, leaving is not always dramatic. It is often internal first. They begin by emotionally distancing themselves. They reduce communication. They create mental space. They tell themselves that independence matters more. They convince themselves that being alone is safer, calmer, and more predictable. This emotional self-sufficiency becomes their comfort zone. So when a relationship starts to challenge that zone, when it begins to require vulnerability, emotional exposure, or dependency, their first response is to retreat inward. And eventually, if nothing changes, that retreat can become physical distance too. Now imagine what it means when someone like that does not follow this pattern. Imagine they feel the same discomfort, the same urge to pull back, the same internal voice saying this is too much. Yet they pause instead of disappearing. That pause is where real emotional significance lies. Because in that moment they are not acting from instinct, they are acting from awareness. They are starting to weigh something deeper than their usual survival strategy. And that something is the value of the connection itself. For an avoidant, staying is not passive. It is active resistance against their own conditioning. It means they are tolerating emotional discomfort that they would normally escape from. It means they are sitting with feelings they usually suppress or detach from. And that requires effort. Real effort. Not the kind of effort that is visible on the surface, but the kind that happens internally, silently. Where no one sees the struggle of staying instead of running, people often misunderstand this silence. They expect love to look expressive, verbal, and consistently warm. But for an avoidant, love in its early or even developing stages can look like endurance. It looks like they're not shutting down completely when things get difficult. It looks like they're still replying even when their instinct is to withdraw. It looks like they're coming back into conversations they would normally avoid. These are not loud actions, but they are deeply meaningful because they go against their default programming. What makes this even more important is the emotional risk involved for them. Staying means exposure, and exposure feels unsafe. When they stay, they are essentially allowing themselves to be seen a little more clearly each time. They are risking dependency, which they often associate with loss of control. They are risking emotional vulnerability, which they may have learned leads to disappointment or overwhelm. So every time they choose to stay, they are not just choosing the relationship, they are also choosing discomfort over safety. That is not a small decision for them, and yet they stay. Not because everything feels perfect, but because something about the connection holds enough meaning that leaving feels like a greater loss than staying feels like a burden. That internal balancing act is subtle but powerful. It is not based on dependency, but on recognition. Something in you becomes significant enough that their usual escape route is no longer the easiest option. This is why their presence should never be underestimated. It may not come with constant reassurance or emotional expression, but it comes with resistance overcome. It comes with internal barriers being questioned. It comes with instinct being challenged. And that is where authenticity begins to show itself, not in perfection, but in persistence. Over time, if this pattern continues, staying becomes less of a struggle and more of a choice they are willing to repeat. They begin to associate your presence with emotional safety rather than emotional pressure. And even though they may still need space, even though they may still retreat at times, the fact that they return instead of disappearing completely becomes a quiet form of commitment. So when an avoidant stays, even when it would be easier to leave, you are not looking at indecision. You are looking at internal conflict being faced instead of avoided. You are looking at emotional resistance being softened, slowly and carefully. And most importantly, you are looking at someone choosing connection in a way that does not come naturally to them. That is not ordinary attachment. That is something deeper taking shape beneath the surface. When an avoidant person starts opening up slowly, it is one of the most important emotional shifts you will ever notice in them. But to understand its depth, you have to understand what opening up actually costs them internally. For most people, sharing thoughts or feelings is normal. For an avoidant, it is exposure. And exposure for them is something their entire emotional system has learned to be careful about. They don't usually struggle because they have nothing to say. In fact, avoidant individuals often have rich inner worlds. They think deeply, reflect constantly, and process emotions internally more than externally. The real challenge is not expressionite as safety. Somewhere in their emotional learning, they develop the belief that revealing too much of themselves can lead to discomfort, rejection, misunderstanding, or loss of control. So instead of sharing freely, they learn to contain, manage, and self-handle their emotions. This is why their emotional world often appears closed off from the outside. It is not empty, it is guarded. And those walls are not built randomly, they are built slowly over time as a form of self-protection. So when those walls begin to shift, even slightly, it is never accidental. It is a process that comes from trust being formed in layers. At first, opening up does not look dramatic. It does not look like long emotional confessions or deep vulnerability. It looks small. It looks like they're saying something personal they normally wouldn't say. It looks like they're sharing a thought without immediately closing the conversation afterward. It looks like they're staying present for just a little longer when emotions enter the space. These moments may seem minor to others, but for them, each one is a step outside their comfort zone. What makes this so meaningful is the internal resistance they are overcoming. Every time they open up, there is a silent negotiation happening in their mind. One part of them wants connection, wants understanding, wants closeness. Another part immediately questions it. Is this safe? Am I exposing too much? Will this be used against me? Will I lose my independence? This internal conflict is constant in the early stages of emotional vulnerability. So when they still choose to share, it means the need for connection is slowly becoming stronger than the need for emotional distance. Trust for an avoidant is not built through words, it is built through repetition of safety. If they open up once and feel judged or overwhelmed, they will likely retreat and close that door again. But if they open up and experience acceptance, calmness, and no emotional pressure in return, something begins to shift inside them. Their nervous system starts learning that vulnerability does not always lead to danger. That learning process is slow, but it is powerful. And because it is slow, it often goes unnoticed. People expect sudden emotional transformation, but avoidants don't work in sudden shifts. They work in gradual expansion, one conversation at a time, one confession at a time, one moment of honesty at a time. Over time, these small openings start to form a pattern, and that pattern is what signals emotional trust. Another important aspect of their opening up is control. Avoidants value control over their emotional expression. They prefer to reveal things in a way that feels manageable. This means they may share something personal, but only to a certain depth. They may talk about feelings, but in a way that still keeps them grounded. This controlled vulnerability is still vulnerability, it just happens within their emotional boundaries. And even that level of sharing is significant, because it means they are allowing someone into spaces they normally keep sealed. It is also important to understand that when they open up, they often do it with hesitation. They may pause mid-sentence. They may shift topics quickly after sharing something personal. They may act casual right after being vulnerable, almost as if trying to reduce the intensity of what they just revealed. This is not dishonesty. It is emotional self-regulation. They are trying to balance closeness with safety at the same time. But over time, if the environment remains safe, something begins to soften. The hesitation reduces. The sharing becomes a little more natural. The pauses become less frequent. And slowly, emotional expression starts to feel less like exposure and more like connection. This is the beginning of emotional security forming inside them. So when you see an avoidant opening up slowly, You are not just seeing communication. You are witnessing the breakdown of long-held emotional defenses. You are seeing trust being tested in real time. You are seeing someone who usually protects their inner world deciding, piece by piece, to let someone stand closer to it. And that is not something that happens easily. It only happens when the connection has reached a point where silence feels heavier than sharing, and where distance starts to feel less safe than presence. When you are dealing with someone who has an avoidant attachment style, one of the most misunderstood signs of their emotional connection is consistency. People often expect love to be loud, expressive, and emotionally intense. So when an avoidant doesn't constantly express feelings, doesn't frequently say emotional words, or doesn't always show visible excitement, they are often misread as disinterested. But what many don't realize is that for avoidance, consistency is not just behavior, it is emotional effort translated into action. An avoidant person is not naturally driven by emotional expression. Their internal system is built around independence, self-regulation, and emotional control. This means that when emotions become intense, their instinct is not to increase expression, but to stabilize distance. They often feel safer when things are predictable, contained, and not overly emotionally demanding. Because of this, inconsistency is actually more natural for them than consistency in emotionally charged situations. So when an avoidant begins to show consistency, it is not something that happens casually. It is a shift against their default emotional rhythm. It means that despite their internal urge to withdraw, despite their need for space, and despite their discomfort with emotional intensity, they are still choosing to remain present in a steady way. That choice carries meaning. Consistency for them is not about constant communication or non-stop emotional sharing. It is about return. It is about reliability. It is about not disappearing when things become complicated. Even if they step back at times, what matters is that they come back. Even if they go quiet, what matters is that they don't disconnect completely. That pattern of returning is where emotional commitment begins to show itself in an avoidant style. This type of consistency is often subtle. It does not always come with reassurance or emotional language. It may look like replying after a delay but still replying. It may look like checking in after distance. It may look like maintaining presence in small but steady ways, rather than overwhelming emotional displays. These actions may seem simple, but for an avoidant, they are not simple at all. They require balancing their need for space with their developing attachment to someone. The reason consistency matters so much for them is because their emotional system is cautious. They don't easily attach in a way that makes them dependent. So when they do start forming a connection, they often do it in a controlled and gradual manner. Consistency becomes their way of testing emotional safety without losing themselves. It allows them to stay connected without feeling trapped. It gives them room to maintain identity while still investing in someone. Another important layer is effort. Avoidants may not always express feelings verbally, but when they are emotionally invested, they often show it through effort-based actions. They may not say, "I miss you" often, but they will still check in. They may not engage in long emotional conversations, but they will still remain present in practical ways. This shift from emotional expression to behavioral consistency is one of the clearest indicators that attachment is forming. What makes this even more meaningful is that consistency goes against their natural withdrawal pattern. When emotional intensity rises in relationships, avoidants typically feel pressure internally. Their system tells them to reduce exposure, to step back, to regain independence. So if instead of fully withdrawing, they choose to stay in a steady rhythm of engagement, it means they are managing that internal pressure rather than escaping it. That is emotional regulation in action, not emotional absence. Over time, this consistency becomes even more significant because it builds trust, not through words, but through predictability. The other person begins to learn that even if the avoidant pulls back, they don't disappear completely. Even if there is distance, there is return. And that return creates emotional stability in the relationship. For avoidants, this is also important because it allows them to stay connected without feeling overwhelmed by constant emotional demands. It is also important to understand that inconsistency in avoidance is often misunderstood. When they pull back temporarily, it is not always rejection. It is often regulation. They are managing emotional overload internally. But what defines real attachment is what happens after that space. If they consistently return, reconnect, and re-engage, It shows that the relationship still holds emotional value for them. In many ways, consistency is the avoidance version of commitment before verbal commitment exists. It is how they show presence without losing their need for independence. It is how they say, "I am still here," without needing to say it directly. And because it requires them to go against their instinct to withdraw, it becomes one of the strongest indicators that emotional attachment is forming. So when you see consistency in an avoidant, don't look for intensity, look for pattern, look for return. Look for effort that continues even when emotional comfort is not guaranteed. Because for them, staying steady is not easy, it is a choice repeated over time. And repeated choice, especially in the face of internal resistance, is where real attachment begins to reveal itself. When an avoidant person starts letting you into their private world, they may become more open and willing to share their thoughts and feelings with you. It is one of the clearest signs that emotional boundaries are beginning to soften in a real way. To understand why this matters so deeply, you have to first understand what their private world actually represents. For an avoidant, their inner world is not just personal space, it is emotional protection, identity, and control all combined into one system. It is where they process everything alone, where they regulate emotions without outside influence, and where they maintain a sense of safety that does not depend on anyone else. Most avoidant individuals grow up learning directly or indirectly that relying too much on others can lead to disappointment, emotional overwhelm, or loss of control. Because of that, they develop a strong internal habit of self-containment. They think through problems alone. They process emotions alone. They make decisions alone. Even when they are in relationships, there is often a part of their life that remains completely sealed off, not because they are hiding something harmful, but because they have learned that privacy equals safety. This is why their personal world is usually very protected. It includes their thoughts, their emotional reactions, their routines, their vulnerabilities, and sometimes even their struggles. They don't easily invite people into these spaces, because doing so requires lowering emotional defenses that have been built over a long time. So when someone is allowed into that inner space, it is never accidental, it is a gradual breaking of emotional barriers. At first, letting someone in does not look dramatic. It may begin with small things. They might start sharing parts of their day that they usually keep to themselves. They might talk about their thoughts more openly, instead of just giving surface-level answers. They might show you how they think, not just what they think. These are subtle shifts, but they are extremely important because they represent a change in control. Instead of fully managing everything internally, they begin to externalize parts of their inner experience. What makes this significant is that for an avoidant, sharing their inner world is not just communication, it is exposure. When they let you see their routines, their habits, or even their quiet moments, they are allowing you into areas they usually manage alone. That means they are no longer fully in control of how those parts of them are perceived. And for someone who values independence and emotional self-sufficiency, that is a big step. As trust builds, this sharing becomes deeper. They might start revealing opinions they don't usually express. They might talk about past experiences they normally avoid discussing. They might let you see their emotional reactions in real time, instead of hiding them or processing them privately. Each of these moments is a sign that emotional walls are becoming less rigid. One of the strongest indicators that you are entering their private world is when they start including you in their thought process. Avoidants often think in detail before they act or speak. Most of this thinking happens internally. But when they begin to verbalize it, when they start explaining how they arrived at a conclusion or why something affects them, they start to get into the nitty-gritty of it. They are essentially inviting you into their internal system. They are allowing you to see how their mind works, which is one of the most intimate forms of sharing for them. Another important layer is emotional visibility. Avoidants are not naturally expressive in a consistent emotional way, especially in the beginning. But when they begin to show emotional reactions around you without immediately shutting down or withdrawing, they may be trying to tell you something. It means they are becoming more comfortable with being emotionally seen. This does not mean they become overly expressive, it means they stop hiding everything. Even small moments of honesty, like admitting stress, uncertainty, or preference, are meaningful because they represent reduced emotional defense. Letting someone into their private world also means they are starting to trust your presence in their emotional space. They begin to believe that you will not disrupt their inner balance. They start to feel that sharing will not automatically lead to pressure or loss of independence. This belief is not formed quickly. It is built through repeated experiences of safety, where they open up slightly and nothing negative follows. Over time, this inclusion becomes more natural. They may start talking about things without being asked. They may share details without filtering them heavily. They may even begin to include you in decisions or thoughts they previously handled alone. This shift shows that their internal boundary between me and others is becoming less rigid. You are no longer fully outside their emotional system. You are gradually becoming part of it. However, even when they let you in, it is important to understand that this does not mean their need for privacy disappears. Avoidants do not lose their inner world, they expand it. They simply begin to allow selective access. They still need time alone, still need emotional space, and still return to internal processing when things feel overwhelming. But the difference is that now, there is someone who is occasionally included in that internal landscape. So when an avoidant starts letting you into their private world, it is not a casual step. It is a sign of trust overcoming long-standing emotional habits. It means they are no longer seeing you as an external presence that might disrupt their independence, but as someone who can exist within it without threatening their sense of self. And for an avoidant, that kind of emotional integration is one of the deepest forms of connection they can offer. When an avoidant person starts trying, especially in ways that feel uncomfortable for them, it is one of the clearest signs that emotional attachment is developing beneath their usual distance. To understand why this is so significant, you have to understand what effort actually feels like for an avoidant. For most people, trying in a relationship is normal. It is communication, compromise, emotional expression, and presence. But for an avoidant, effort often means stepping directly into discomfort. It means going against their instinct to withdraw, simplify, or emotionally shut down when things feel too intense. Their natural pattern is not effort through emotional engagement, but effort through emotional regulation. They prefer to manage things internally, reduce dependence, and maintain a sense of control over their emotional state. So when a situation requires emotional exposure, vulnerability, or sustained closeness, their default response is often to create distance, not because they don't care, but because distance is how they regain internal stability. This is why it becomes so meaningful when they start trying instead of retreating. Trying for them is not a casual behavior. It is a conscious override of their automatic defense system. It means they are choosing connection over comfort. And that choice is not easy for someone whose emotional wiring is built around self-protection. One of the first ways this effort appears is in communication. An avoidant may not naturally engage in long emotional conversations, but when they start responding more thoughtfully, staying present in discussions longer than usual, or making an effort to explain themselves instead of shutting down, that is significant. It shows they are no longer relying solely on withdrawal as a coping mechanism. Instead, they are attempting to stay engaged even when the topic feels emotionally demanding. Another form of effort appears in conflict situations. Conflict is one of the biggest triggers for avoidant withdrawal. When emotions rise, tension builds, or expectations feel heavy, their instinct is to disengage to protect themselves. So when they begin to stay in the conversation instead of walking away, even if they are uncomfortable, that is a major shift. It means they are prioritizing the relationship enough to tolerate emotional discomfort instead of escaping it. Trying also shows up in the form of emotional awareness. Avoidants are not always naturally expressive about feelings, but when they begin to acknowledge emotions, either their own or the other person's, it shows they are becoming more emotionally present. Even small statements like recognizing someone's feelings or admitting their own confusion or stress can be very effective in helping to break the silence and create a more comfortable and supportive environment, are signs that they are stepping out of pure emotional avoidance and into emotional participation. What makes this effort especially meaningful is that it is not driven by external pressure alone. In fact, avoidants often resist pressure. If they feel forced or emotionally cornered, they are more likely to withdraw. So when they try, it usually comes from internal motivation rather than obligation. Something in the connection has become important enough that they are willing to face discomfort rather than avoid it. This internal motivation is key. It means the relationship is not just something they are tolerating, it is something they are investing in. even if quietly. That investment may not look like traditional romantic expression, but it shows up in behavioral adjustments. They start adapting. They start making small changes in how they respond, how they communicate, and how they stay present. Effort also becomes visible in consistency during emotional moments. Instead of disappearing when things become intense, they begin to stay connected in some form. They may take space, but they return. They may pause, but they re-engage. This pattern of returning after discomfort is one of the strongest indicators that they are trying to maintain connection instead of avoiding it completely. It is also important to understand that for avoidance, trying often feels draining. Emotional engagement requires energy they are not naturally inclined to spend in relational intensity. So when they continue trying despite that internal fatigue, it means the emotional value of the relationship is outweighing the cost of discomfort. That balance is what keeps them engaged, even when it feels difficult. Another subtle but powerful form of effort is emotional consideration. When they start thinking about how their actions affect the other person, when they begin adjusting behavior slightly to avoid unnecessary distance or misunderstanding, that shows emotional awareness developing. It is not about perfection, it is about intention. They are no longer acting purely from self-protection, they are factoring in connection. Over time, this effort becomes a pattern rather than a moment. And patterns are what matter most when understanding avoidant attachment. One isolated act does not define emotional investment, but repeated willingness to stay engaged despite discomfort does. That repetition shows that something is changing internally. Their relationship with closeness is becoming less threatening and more manageable. Ultimately, when an avoidant starts trying, what you are witnessing is not just behavior change, it is emotional resistance being challenged. It is the beginning of integration between their need for independence and their growing attachment to someone. They are learning slowly and cautiously that connection does not always have to come at the cost of self-loss, and that learning process, even when imperfect, is one of the clearest signs that genuine emotional investment is forming beneath the surface. When an avoidant person does not fully disappear, even during stress, distance, or emotional overwhelm, it is one of the most important signs that the connection holds real emotional weight for them. To most people, not disappearing might sound like a small thing, but for an avoidant attachment style, it carries a much deeper psychological meaning. Their natural defense system is built around withdrawal. When things feel too intense, too emotionally demanding, or too close for comfort, their instinct is to create space, sometimes subtle, sometimes complete. This space is not always dramatic. It can start with reduced communication, delayed responses, emotional detachment, or a shift into minimal interaction. Internally, this withdrawal is a way for them to regain control over their emotional state. They regulate overwhelming feelings by stepping back, reducing input, and returning to independence. This is their safe zone. So when emotional intensity rises in a relationship, their automatic response is often to retreat into that space. Because of this, full disappearance is not unusual for avoidance in certain situations. When they feel emotionally flooded or overwhelmed, they may shut down communication entirely for a period of time, not necessarily because they do not care, but because they need to reset internally. It is a self-protective mechanism, not always a rejection of the relationship itself. This is why the moment they choose not to fully disappear becomes so meaningful. It shows that even in emotional discomfort, something is holding them in connection. Instead of completely detaching, they remain partially present. Instead of cutting off, they maintain some level of access. That not fully leaving is where emotional attachment begins to reveal itself more clearly than words ever could. For an avoidant, staying partially connected during stress is not effortless. It requires them to manage two conflicting internal forces at the same time. One force pushes them toward distance, silence, and emotional relief. The other pulls them toward connection, familiarity, and emotional attachment. When they do not fully disappear, it means the pull of connection is strong enough to prevent total withdrawal. This internal balancing act is important to understand. Avoidants are not always aware of it in a fully conscious way. They may simply feel overwhelmed and decide to reduce contact rather than cut it off completely. But even that decision reflects something deeper. The relationship has enough emotional significance that severing it entirely feels more difficult than maintaining a minimal connection. Not disappearing also reflects a form of emotional responsibility developing within them. While avoidants value independence, they are not incapable of caring about emotional impact. When they begin to realize that complete disappearance could cause emotional rupture or confusion, and they still choose to remain somewhat present, it shows a growing awareness of relational impact. That awareness is part of emotional maturity developing in real time. Another important aspect is attachment tolerance. Avoidants often struggle with sustained emotional closeness, especially when it becomes intense or demanding. But when they do not fully disconnect, it suggests that their tolerance for attachment is increasing. They are learning to stay connected without feeling overwhelmed to the point of complete shutdown. This does not mean they are fully comfortable, but it does mean they are expanding their capacity to remain in relational space. Even minimal contact during withdrawal carries meaning. A message after silence, a check-in after distance, or a return after emotional pause are all signs that the connection has not been abandoned internally. For avoidance, returning is often more significant than continuous presence. The act of coming back shows that the bond still exists in their emotional system, even if it temporarily goes offline during stress. It is also important to recognize that when they do not fully disappear, they are often still processing internally. Avoidants rarely stop thinking about relationships completely, even when they step away. Their silence is not always absence of thought, it is often processing, regulation, and emotional sorting. So their eventual return or continued minimal presence reflects that the connection remains part of their internal landscape. What makes this even more meaningful is that avoidance typically pushes towards separation when emotional load becomes too heavy. So when separation does not fully happen, it indicates that the emotional load is being tolerated, not rejected. They are holding the connection in a fragile but intentional way, rather than letting it dissolve completely. Over time, this pattern becomes one of the strongest indicators of attachment in avoidant dynamics. Not because they never withdraw, but because they do not fully break the bond. The connection remains intact, even if temporarily distant. And that intactness shows that the relationship has moved beyond casual interaction into something that carries emotional significance for them. Ultimately, when an avoidant does not fully disappear, what you are seeing is not just presence at is restraint. It is the decision, conscious or unconscious, to maintain a thread of connection, even when their instinct pushes them toward complete withdrawal. And that thread, however thin it may appear at times, is often the clearest evidence that authentic emotional attachment is present beneath their distance.